On the third day inside the dark wilderness of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, the Roman army was no longer an army. What had once been 3 disciplined legions, nearly 20,000 of the most professional soldiers in the ancient world, had dissolved into scattered groups of exhausted men fighting for their lives in the mud, rain, and choking forest. The proud formations that had conquered half the known world could not exist here. The ground was too uneven, the trees too dense, and the enemy too elusive. Somewhere in the collapsing column rode the Roman commander, Publius Quinctilius Varus, a governor who only days earlier believed he was marching through a peaceful province of the empire. Now he could see the terrible reality unfolding around him. The cavalry units meant to protect the column were abandoning their positions. Messengers failed to return. Eagle standards, the sacred symbols of Roman power, were surrounded. The narrow path ahead was blocked, and the hills around them seemed alive with invisible enemies. For the first time, Varus understood the truth. This was no rebellion to suppress. It was a trap, carefully planned, patiently prepared, and perfectly executed. The Roman legions had not marched into hostile territory by accident. They had been led here. As the sounds of battle echoed through the ravine and the Roman line began to collapse, Varus faced a decision no commander ever wished to confront. Capture meant humiliation, torture, and the end of Roman authority in these lands. Looking at the chaos around him, he chose the only escape left to him. Drawing his sword beneath the cold gray sky, the Roman governor made his final decision, sealing the fate of 3 entire legions in one of history's most devastating military disasters. To understand how 3 Roman legions could vanish in the forests of northern Europe, we have to step back from the chaos of the battlefield and look at the world Rome believed it controlled. At the beginning of the 1st century AD, the Roman Empire stood at the height of its power. For decades, Roman armies had expanded steadily across Europe, conquering new territories and turning distant lands into orderly provinces governed by Roman law. Roads were built, taxes were collected, and local leaders were expected to cooperate with the authority of Rome. From the Roman perspective, expansion was not just a military policy, it was the natural order of things. For nearly 20 years, Roman forces had pushed beyond the western bank of the Rhine River into the vast lands known as Germania. These territories were very different from the urbanized provinces of the Mediterranean world. Instead of cities, there were scattered tribal settlements. Instead of paved roads and open farmland, there were thick forests, rivers, and marshlands that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. Yet Roman commanders believed the campaign had succeeded. After years of military operations, they assumed the tribes had been pacified and the region was ready to be absorbed into the empire. The Rhine River played a crucial role in this strategy. Flowing from the Alps to the North Sea, it formed a natural dividing line between the Roman world and the tribal lands of northern Europe. On the western side of the Rhine lay Roman Gaul, a stable and prosperous province filled with cities, trade routes, and fortified military bases. On the eastern side lay Germania, a region Rome hoped would soon follow the same path. Roman planners envisioned the Rhine no longer as a frontier, but as an internal river flowing through imperial territory. It was in this context that Publius Quinctilius Varus arrived in the region. Varus was not sent to wage a brutal campaign of conquest. In fact, the opposite was true. The emperor believed the fighting was largely finished. Varus was dispatched as a governor, a political administrator tasked with organizing the new province. His responsibilities were familiar to Roman officials across the empire: establish Roman law, collect taxes, resolve disputes between local tribes, and integrate the region into the imperial system. To support this transition, Varus commanded 3 experienced legions, powerful units that represented some of the most disciplined soldiers in the ancient world. But these forces were not meant to conduct major military operations. They were there as a symbol of Roman authority, a reminder that the empire stood behind its new administration. From the Roman perspective, Germania was no longer a hostile frontier. It was a territory in the final stages of becoming Roman. Yet beneath this appearance of stability, the situation was far more fragile than Roman leaders realized. The forests of Germania hid more than unfamiliar terrain. They concealed resentment, tribal rivalries, and leaders who had no intention of accepting Roman rule. Among them was a man who understood Rome better than Rome understood him, a man who had spent years inside the Roman system, learning its strengths, its habits, and its blind spots. His name was Arminius, and the empire's confidence in its own success would soon lead its armies straight into the most devastating ambush in Roman history. At the center of the unfolding disaster stood a man who seemed, at first glance, to embody Rome's success in Germania. His name was Arminius, a noble born among the Cherusei tribe but shaped by the very empire he would one day betray. As a child, Arminius had been taken to Rome as a political hostage, an old imperial practice meant to guarantee loyalty from tribal leaders. In Rome, he received a Roman education, learned the Latin language, and served in the Roman military. Over time, he earned citizenship and even the rank of an auxiliary commander. To Roman officials, he appeared to be living proof that the empire could transform so-called barbarians into loyal allies. By the time Publius Quinctilius Varus arrived to govern the region, Arminius had become one of his most trusted local advisors. He understood the terrain, spoke the languages of the tribes, and seemed eager to help Rome maintain order in Germania. Varus relied on him frequently, seeing him as a bridge between Roman authority and the complex network of tribal communities beyond the Rhine. What Varus did not realize was that Arminius had come to a very different conclusion about Rome's presence in his homeland. While outwardly cooperating with Roman administration, Arminius quietly began building a resistance movement among the Germanic tribes. This was no simple task. The tribes of Germania were notoriously divided, often fighting among themselves over land, honor, and leadership. But Arminius understood something crucial: Rome's expansion threatened them all. If they continued to fight each other, Rome would eventually dominate every tribe east of the Rhine. To stop that outcome, the tribes would have to do something rare: set aside their rivalries and unite against a common enemy. The opportunity came in the late summer of the year 9 AD. Arminius approached Varus with urgent news. According to his report, a rebellion had broken out among several tribes farther north. Local villages were supposedly resisting Roman authority, and immediate action was required before the unrest spread across the region. For a Roman governor tasked with maintaining stability, such reports could not be ignored. Varus believed he was dealing with a minor uprising, the kind of disturbance that could be resolved quickly by marching a show of force through the countryside. Arminius then proposed a solution. Rather than following the longer and safer route along established roads, he suggested a shortcut through a heavily forested region that would allow the Roman army to reach the troubled area quickly. The route would cut directly through the rugged terrain later known as the site of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. To Varus, the advice seemed logical. He trusted Arminius completely, and the mission appeared routine. So the Roman governor gave the order to move. What followed was a massive procession stretching nearly 9 miles through the wilderness. 3 legions, along with cavalry units, camp followers, supply wagons, engineers, servants, and families, formed a long, slow-moving column winding through narrow forest paths. This was not a battle formation. It was the marching structure of an army that believed it was traveling through friendly territory. Soldiers carried tools, baggage, and equipment meant for administration and settlement, not for immediate combat. Shortly after the march began, Arminius requested permission to ride ahead. He told Varus he would gather loyal tribal allies who would join the Roman force in suppressing the supposed rebellion. Varus agreed without hesitation. It seemed like another example of Arminius strengthening Rome's position in Germania. But Arminius did not ride out to gather allies for Rome. Instead, he rode into the forest to finalize a plan that had been months in the making. Messengers spread through the countryside, calling warriors from the Cherusei, the Marsi, the Bructeri, and other tribes to assemble. Ancient rivalries were temporarily forgotten as thousands of Germanic fighters prepared to strike the invading army. They knew the terrain. They knew the weather. Most importantly, they knew exactly where the Roman column would be marching. For the Roman soldiers moving deeper into the forests, nothing seemed unusual at first. But with every mile, they were unknowingly walking into one of the most carefully prepared ambushes in ancient history. The The Roman column had already marched deep into unfamiliar territory when the first signs of trouble appeared. Dark clouds gathered over the forests of northern Germania, and a violent storm rolled across the landscape. Rain poured through the thick canopy of oak and pine, turning narrow paths into rivers of mud. Heavy wagons sank into the ground, horses struggled for footing, and the once orderly Roman formations stretched farther and farther apart. What had been a confident march now became a slow, exhausting struggle against the elements. Somewhere in that endless line of soldiers, the first attacks began. At the rear of the column, small groups of men started disappearing. A few isolated soldiers vanished into the trees. A supply handler failed to return from a short errand. At first, it seemed like confusion caused by the storm. But then the javelins came flying out of the forest. Warriors hidden among the trees struck quickly and without warning before vanishing back into the darkness. The Roman soldiers tried to respond, but the enemy refused to stand and fight. It was the beginning of a relentless campaign of hit-and-run warfare led by Arminius, who knew exactly how Roman troops would react. Roman legionaries were trained for open battlefields where their formations could operate with deadly precision. In those conditions, few armies on earth could challenge them. But inside the thick woods of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, those advantages disappeared. The trees were too dense to form proper battle lines. The uneven ground broke their formations apart. Heavy armor and shields became burdens rather than protection, dragging soldiers down as they tried to maneuver through mud and tangled roots. As the first day of fighting drew to a close, Publius Quinctilius Varus ordered his exhausted troops to halt and construct a defensive camp. Roman soldiers were masters of field engineering, and even under pressure they managed to dig earthworks and raise crude barriers for protection. Inside the temporary camp, the survivors huddled together in the rain. Wagons were burned to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. Supplies that slowed the army were abandoned. Through the long, sleepless night, the Romans could hear distant chanting echoing through the forest as Germanic warriors celebrated the day's success and interrogated prisoners. At dawn, the legions tried to break free. Hoping to reach open ground where their formations might function again, they pushed forward through the forest. But the attacks never stopped. Warriors appeared from behind trees, hurled spears, then vanished before the Romans could respond. Hour after hour, the column was slowly worn down. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Units lost contact with each other. What had once been a disciplined army was steadily dissolving into scattered fragments. By the third day, the surviving Romans marched into a narrow corridor of land later known as the Cochrys Narrows. On one side rose a steep hillside. On the other stretched an impassable swamp. Waiting above them was the final stage of the trap. The Germanic tribes had constructed a concealed wall of earth and timber along the hillside, creating a fortified barrier that ran parallel to the Roman path. From this elevated position, thousands of warriors rained spears, stones, and arrows down onto the trapped column. Panic spread quickly. Cavalry units attempted to charge the wall but found no room to maneuver. Horses slipped in the mud and crashed into the infantry. Germanic fighters surged forward through gaps in the barrier, striking the Romans before retreating behind their defenses. The disciplined structure that had defined the Roman army for centuries finally broke. Officers lost control of their men. Groups of soldiers fought in isolated clusters, surrounded on all sides by enemies who knew the terrain far better than they did. As the battle reached its terrible conclusion, the remaining legionaries made their final stand in the rain-soaked forest. There was no escape route left, no formation that could restore order. By nightfall, the killing was complete. Nearly 20,000 Roman soldiers lay dead in the mud, and 3 entire legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, had been wiped from the rolls of the Roman army forever. When the storm finally passed and the forests grew quiet again, the scale of the disaster slowly became clear. 3 entire Roman legions, some of the most experienced soldiers in the empire, had vanished in the mud and trees of Germania. The proud numbers of the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions would never appear again on Rome's military rolls. Their standards were lost, their officers dead, and nearly 20,000 men had been erased from one of the most powerful armies the world had ever seen. The tragedy of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest was not just a battlefield defeat, it was a psychological shock that rippled across the Roman world. When news reached Augustus, the emperor reportedly reacted with deep anguish. Ancient historians record that for months he would wander through his palace crying out, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." It was more than grief for lost soldiers. It was the realization that Rome's belief in its unstoppable expansion had collided with a harsh reality. The empire that had conquered Gaul, Spain, Greece, and Egypt had finally met a frontier it could not easily control. In the years that followed, Roman strategy changed. Instead of pushing deeper into the forests of northern Europe, the empire consolidated its defenses along the Rhine River. Fortresses, watchtowers, and fortified camps were built along its banks. The Rhine was no longer just a river on the map. It became a boundary between two worlds. To the west stood the Roman provinces, shaped by Latin language, Roman law, and imperial infrastructure. To the east remained the lands of the Germanic tribes, independent and culturally distinct. In many ways, those three catastrophic days helped shape the future of Europe. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest halted Rome's northern expansion and defined a frontier that would influence politics, culture, and identity for centuries. It is a powerful reminder that even the greatest empires can misjudge the land they seek to control and the people who call it home. If you enjoy exploring the dramatic turning points of world history like this one, consider supporting the channel. Subscribe for more in-depth historical stories, leave a comment sharing your thoughts about this battle, and join us as we uncover the moments that quietly shaped the world we live in today.